That night, he stood by the door longer than usual. Everything in him said it would be easier to leave. The cold was winning. His body was tired, and no one would have blamed him for walking away. But some decisions aren't made out loud. They're made in the quiet, when no one is watching. And once made, they change who you become. The night settled over the edge of town with a stillness that felt heavier than usual, the cold pressing against the small house as if it had learned his weaknesses and decided to test them all at once. The man noticed it almost immediately, not because the wind was louder or the snow deeper, but because time itself seemed to slow, stretching each moment longer than it should have. He stood near the center of the room, unmoving, his breath shallow, listening to the familiar creaks of old wood responding to the dropping temperature. This house had always spoken to him in winter. Tonight, its voice sounded tired. He was in his early 70s, tall once but now slightly stooped, his frame lean and weathered rather than frail. His face carried deep lines carved by decades of work and discipline, with a narrow jaw, prominent cheekbones, and eyes that had learned to stay calm even when the body protested. His hair was thin and gray, cut short out of habit rather than vanity, and a trimmed salt and pepper beard framed a mouth that rarely smiled but never complained. He wore the same dark olive jacket he always did indoors during winter, layered over a thick gray sweater, brown work pants, and worn boots he had not bothered to remove yet. Pain moved through him quietly, the way it always did now. It started in his lower back, a dull pressure that grew sharper if he shifted his weight too quickly, then crept into his knees, reminding him of old injuries and colder years spent outdoors when rest had been optional. He did not wince. He had learned long ago that reacting only gave pain more room. Instead, he stood and waited for it to settle, as if patience itself might negotiate a truce. Near his left side sat the German Shepherd, an older dog by the standards of the breed, with a thick sable coat darkened along the back and lighter around the chest and muzzle. Gray had begun to show around the dog's face as well, especially near the eyes, which were amber and alert but no longer restless. The dog's ears were upright, his posture calm, his body angled slightly toward the man without pressing against him. He was not young, but he was steady. Years earlier, the dog had been all motion and vigilance, pacing windows, reacting to every sound beyond the walls. Now he watched more than he moved. The man noticed the dog's breathing before his own, slow, even, reliable. It grounded him. He shifted his weight carefully and took a single step toward the window. The movement sent a brief spike of pain through his hip, sharper than before, and for a moment he considered sitting down. Instead, he stopped again, his hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, his fingers stiff and rough from years of labor that no one in town seemed to remember anymore. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, not heavily, but persistently, dusting the ground and softening the outlines of the road beyond the house. The streetlight at the corner cast a pale glow that barely reached his window, illuminating nothing of importance. He had lived on this edge of town long enough to know that darkness came earlier here and stayed longer. He found himself thinking about how easily the night had arrived. No warning, no ceremony, just a gradual dimming until everything familiar looked slightly altered. That was how age had arrived, too. Not all at once, but in small, accumulating losses. Strength went first, then speed, then the certainty that tomorrow would feel much like today. He exhaled slowly and leaned closer to the window, resting his forearm against the sill. The cold seeped through the glass, biting into his skin, but he did not pull away. Part of him wanted to test himself, to see how much he could still tolerate without complaint. It was a habit formed in another life, one defined by structure, early mornings, and a belief that endurance was a measure of worth. He had not spoken about that life in years. People in town saw only what remained, a quiet old man who kept to himself, who walked slower now, who had chosen to stay behind when others had left. They did not know what discipline had once shaped his days or how loss had taught him the value of silence. The dog rose smoothly to his feet and stepped closer, brushing his side against the man's leg in a brief, deliberate gesture. Not a plea, not a demand, just contact. The man lowered his hand and rested it on the dog's shoulder, feeling the familiar solidity beneath the fur. It steadied him more than the chair had. He looked down at the animal and studied the signs he could not ignore, the slower rise and fall of the chest, the stiffness that appeared after long periods of rest, the patience that had replaced urgency. They were aging together in ways that felt unspoken but deeply understood. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. Each second landed with weight. He realized then that he had been standing for a long time, longer than his body preferred, and that the night was far from over. Sleep would not come easily. It rarely did anymore. Lying down meant listening to pain argue its case in the dark, replaying old decisions, wondering which ones still mattered. He turned slightly, angling his body toward the door without fully committing to the movement. The coat hung where it always did, heavy and familiar, its pockets still carrying traces of the past. He did not reach for it. Not yet. The thought of leaving crossed his mind in a distant, practical way, as if it belonged to someone else. He could go. He knew that. No one would stop him. No one would even ask why. The town had already decided what it expected of him, and it was not resilience. He closed his eyes briefly and listened to the wind push against the house, probing for weaknesses, searching for entry. The dog remained beside him, silent and watchful, his presence neither reassuring nor alarming, simply constant. When the man opened his eyes again, the room looked the same, but he felt the subtle shift inside himself, the recognition that this night would demand more patience than most. He stayed where he was, hand resting on the dog, breathing through the discomfort, allowing the moment to stretch. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, time moved at its own pace, and for now, that was enough. Morning arrived without urgency, the light outside the window pale and thin, as if the day itself was reluctant to begin. The man woke already tired, not from lack of sleep alone, but from the familiar weight that had settled into his body long before dawn. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house warm slowly around him and cataloging the signals his body sent before he even moved. His shoulders ached first, stiff and resistant, followed by a dull pressure along his spine that reminded him he had stood too long the night before. When he finally pushed himself upright, the motion sent a sharp protest through his knees, forcing him to pause on the edge of the bed, breathing carefully until the sensation dulled into something manageable. He had learned the rhythm of these mornings. Rush only made things worse. The mirror in the small bathroom reflected a version of himself he no longer tried to correct. His face looked thinner than it once had, the angles sharper, the skin drawn tighter across bone. The gray in his beard had spread unevenly, giving him an older appearance than his years, and the dark circles beneath his eyes spoke of nights spent half awake, negotiating with discomfort. He washed his face slowly, bracing one hand against the sink, aware that balance no longer came automatically. Simple tasks required attention now. Outside the bedroom, the German shepherd waited, rising from the floor as soon as he heard movement. The dog stretched carefully, back legs extending first, then the front, his motions deliberate rather than fluid. The man noticed that too. He always did. They mirrored each other more than either of them seemed to realize. Breakfast was quiet. The man moved through the kitchen with practiced familiarity, though each step felt heavier than it should have. Lifting the kettle strained his wrist. Reaching into the cabinet forced his shoulder to remind him of its limits. These were not dramatic failures, just small resistances, accumulating until even the simplest routine felt like work. He set food down for the dog, watching as the animal ate at a slower pace than he once had, pausing between bites as if listening to his own body as well. The man recognized the signs because he saw them in himself every day. Afterward, he pulled on his jacket and stepped outside, determined to keep the pattern of his days intact for as long as possible. The cold air hit him immediately, sharper in daylight, stealing his breath and tightening his chest. He stood on the porch longer than necessary, steadying himself before taking the first step down. The yard looked unchanged, snow pressed flat in places where he and the dog had walked the night before. He followed the familiar path, boots crunching softly, the dog moving close at his side. He did not walk far. Halfway to the fence, his lower back tightened, sending a warning that felt more serious than the usual ache. He stopped, resting his hands on his thighs, head lowered, breath fogging the air. The dog halted with him, waiting without impatience. In that moment, the man understood something he had been avoiding. His body was no longer something he could push past with will alone. It had limits now, and those limits were narrowing. The realization unsettled him more than the pain. For most of his life, endurance had been non-negotiable. You worked through discomfort. You finished what you started. Weakness was something you addressed privately, if at all. That belief had carried him through years of demanding labor and long stretches of solitude. Now it felt less certain. He straightened slowly and turned back toward the house, each step measured. Inside again, warmth returned to his hands, but not to his thoughts. He sat heavily in the chair near the window, the one he favored because it allowed him to rest without fully surrendering to it. The dog settled at his feet, close enough that their legs touched. He stared outside, watching the wind move snow along the road, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to ask a question he had been pushing away. How much longer could he keep this up? Not just the house, not just the routine, but the act of standing on his own terms. The answer did not come easily. He considered what leaving would mean, how it might look from the outside, sensible, necessary, inevitable. People in town would nod, perhaps even feel relieved. They had already decided he was slowing down. This would only confirm it. The thought stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, not pride exactly, but a quiet resistance. He was not ready to be reduced to an expectation. He lowered his gaze to the dog, studying the way the animal rested without fully sleeping, ears still attentive, body relaxed but present. The dog had adapted without complaint, adjusted his pace, conserved his energy. There was no shame in it. The man leaned back, exhaling slowly, and accepted what his body was telling him, even as he resisted what it implied. He would need to move differently now. Think differently. Endurance would no longer be measured by how much pain he ignored, but by how honestly he faced it. Outside, the day continued, indifferent to his internal reckoning. Inside, the man remained seated, dog at his feet, listening to the quiet, aware that this question would return, whether he was ready for it or not. By late afternoon, the light outside had already begun to thin, the sky paling into a colorless gray that made it difficult to tell how much of the day remained. The man stood near the front of the house, closer to the door than he usually allowed himself to be, aware of the way his body shifted instinctively into a stance he had not used in years. The door itself was unremarkable, its paint worn smooth by time and weather, the handle cold even from across the room. It had always represented passage rather than escape, a threshold crossed countless times without thought. Today, it felt different. He adjusted his weight carefully, testing his balance, and felt the subtle pull in his lower back that warned him against sudden movement. The knowledge that his body might fail him at the wrong moment sat heavily in his chest. He had spent most of his life trusting himself to respond when needed, to act without hesitation. That trust had eroded quietly, replaced by calculation. He reached out and rested his hand against the wall beside the door instead of the handle, grounding himself. The German shepherd sat a few feet away, watching him with calm attentiveness. The dog's posture was relaxed, neither alert nor disengaged, as if he understood that this moment required presence rather than action. The man's eyes moved to the coat hanging on its hook, dark and heavy, its shape familiar. He remembered shrugging it on without thought, stepping into cold mornings when his body had been an instrument rather than an obstacle. Those mornings felt distant now, not because of nostalgia, but because the man he had been then no longer existed in quite the same way. He did not resent that. Change was inevitable. What unsettled him was the uncertainty of how much choice remained. He shifted again, closer to the door this time, and felt his breath shorten. The simple act of standing upright for so long had begun to tax him. He considered sitting down, letting the moment pass, but something held him there. Leaving was not about distance. It was about acknowledgement. Stepping outside would mean admitting that staying might no longer be enough. The town beyond the door remained quiet, muffled by snow and distance. He imagined the road, the way it curved away from the house, leading toward places where help existed, where expectations were lower, where people would not be surprised to see him slow down. The thought carried a strange mixture of relief and resistance. Relief, because it offered an end to the constant negotiation with pain. Resistance, because it implied surrender to an identity he was not ready to accept. He glanced down at the dog who had not moved. The animal's eyes met his briefly, steady and unassuming, then shifted back toward the room. There was no urging in that look, no judgment, just acceptance. The man recognized the difference immediately. Pressure came from the outside world. This did not. He drew a slow breath and placed his palm against the door, feeling the chill through the wood. His fingers curled slightly, testing the handle without turning it. The motion sent a jolt through his wrist, sharp enough to make him still. Pain, again insisting on being acknowledged. He closed his eyes for a moment, and memories surfaced unbidden. Not of specific events, but of a way of moving through the world that had once been automatic, of trusting his body to keep up with his decisions. Those memories did not comfort him. They reminded him of the distance he had traveled, not measured in miles, but in capability. When he opened his eyes, the room looked unchanged, but he felt exposed, as if the act of standing here had stripped something away. He had not turned the handle. He had not stepped outside. The door remained closed. That mattered more than he expected. The dog rose then, moving closer without sound, stopping at his side. The man felt the warmth through his pant leg and let his hand drop to the animal's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur. The contact grounded him in the present. Whatever choice awaited him, it would not be made in abstraction. It would be made here, with the limits of his body and the weight of his days fully accounted for. He stepped back from the door, not abruptly, but with intention, creating distance between himself and the threshold. The coat remained on its hook. He did not remove his boots. This was not a retreat. It was a pause. He turned toward the interior of the house, aware of the way his muscles protested the movement, and made his way slowly toward the chair by the window. The dog followed, resuming his place without instruction. Outside, the light continued to fade. Inside, the man sat down carefully, his body grateful for the relief, his mind unsettled but clear. The door stayed closed behind him, not locked, not barred, simply untouched. He did not know yet what that meant. He only knew that the decision had not been made, and that for now, the choice to wait was one he could still live with. Evening settled quietly into the house, the kind of early darkness that arrived before anyone was ready for it, dulling the edges of the room and softening the contrast between inside and out. The man sat in the chair by the window, his body angled slightly forward, forearms resting on his thighs as if he were preparing to stand again, though he did not. His breathing had slowed since he left the door, but the tension in his shoulders remained, a residual alertness that had nowhere to go. The German shepherd lay at his feet, close enough that their legs touched, his body curved inward, head resting on his paws. The dog's eyes were open, not watching anything in particular, simply aware. The man noticed how easily the animal occupied the space, how naturally he seemed to understand when to move and when not to. There was no instruction between them, no signal exchanged. The dog had learned this presence over time, through years of shared quiet rather than commands. The man shifted slightly, adjusting his position to relieve the pressure in his lower back, and felt the familiar resistance in his muscles. The dog lifted his head just enough to register the movement, then settled again when no further action followed. It was a small response, almost invisible, but it reminded the man of how closely the dog tracked him, not out of duty, but habit and care. He had known people who confused loyalty with obedience. This was different. It was attentiveness without expectation. The room held the faint smells of old wood, cold air, and the remains of the day's routine. Outside, the wind moved along the road, pushing snow into soft drifts that gathered and dispersed without purpose. Inside, nothing demanded his attention. That absence felt unfamiliar. For most of his life, stillness had been something you earned only after work was done, or something forced upon you by circumstances you resisted. Now, it was simply there. He let his gaze rest on the dog, taking in the details he had learned to read instinctively, the way one ear angled slightly back even at rest, the slow expansion of the rib cage, the patience in the animal's posture. Age had not dulled the dog's awareness, only refined it. He had stopped reacting to every sound, choosing instead to conserve energy, to remain ready without urgency. The man wondered when that shift had happened. Perhaps it had not been a moment at all, but a gradual acceptance, unnoticed until it was complete. He leaned back into the chair, allowing his spine to settle against the worn wood, and closed his eyes briefly. Pain was still present, but quieter now, as if acknowledging that it had been heard. His thoughts drifted, not toward the door or the road beyond it, but inward, to the steady rhythm of breath and the warmth near his feet. He realized then how rare it was to be with someone who did not require explanation. The dog did not ask why he had stood by the door so long. He did not need reassurance. He did not mistake hesitation for weakness. He was simply there, sharing the same space, the same silence, without trying to shape it. That presence carried weight. It reminded the man that endurance did not always announce itself through action. Sometimes it took the form of staying still, of allowing the body to rest without interpreting rest as failure. He opened his eyes again and looked toward the window, watching darkness press closer to the glass. Night would come soon enough. There would be time to think about what came next. For now, he remained where he was, grounded by the quiet certainty at his feet. The dog shifted slightly, pressing closer, and the man let his hand fall to the animal's back, resting there without movement. Neither of them spoke, and nothing needed to be decided. In that moment, the simple act of being together felt sufficient, a small but steady anchor against the uncertainty waiting beyond the walls. Night deepened without ceremony, the house settling into a silence that felt less oppressive than before, as if it had accepted his presence rather than challenged it. The man remained seated by the window longer than he usually allowed himself to, aware of the way fatigue moved through his body in slow waves. This was the hour when decisions were often made, not because clarity arrived, but because there was nothing left to distract from the truth. He shifted forward, resting his hands on his knees, and stood carefully, pausing to let the familiar dizziness pass. The room tilted slightly, then steadied. He did not rush it. Rushing belonged to another version of himself. He took one measured step toward the door, then another, his movements deliberate, almost restrained. The dog rose with him, matching the pace without crowding, his presence close but unobtrusive. The coat still hung where it had earlier, heavy with implication. He stopped in front of it and lifted his hand, fingers brushing the fabric. The weight was immediately apparent, not just in the cloth itself, but in what it represented. Leaving would be simple in execution, complicated only by what it admitted. He imagined the relief of warmth elsewhere, of hands that could help when his own failed, of nights where pain did not require negotiation. None of that frightened him. What unsettled him was how easily the decision could be justified. That ease made him wary. He lowered his hand and let it fall back to his side. The dog remained still, watching without expectation. There was no sound urging him forward, no signal to stop. The choice belonged entirely to him. He stepped away from the door and crossed the room instead, each movement a quiet confirmation. Reaching the coat hook again, he did not remove the garment. He adjusted it, straightening the sleeve where it had slipped, a small, almost domestic gesture that surprised him with its finality. The act was not defiant. It was not brave. It was simply precise. He turned toward the interior of the house and felt the shift immediately, not in his body, but in his mind. Something had settled. The dog followed as he moved back toward the chair, circling once before lowering himself onto the floor. The man sat slowly, his joints protesting, but his breath steady. He rested his hands on his thighs and allowed himself to acknowledge what he had done. He had chosen to stay, not out of stubbornness, but because leaving felt premature. The decision carried no promise of success. It did not guarantee comfort. It offered only continuity. Another night, another morning, if it came. He listened to the wind outside, less aggressive now, and to the quiet inside the room. No one would know what had just taken place. There would be no marker, no visible change. By morning, the world would look the same. But within the stillness, the man recognized the significance of what he had allowed himself, the right to remain for now on his own terms. The dog shifted slightly, pressing closer, and the man reached down to rest his hand on the animal's back, a simple acknowledgement of shared ground. Nothing more needed to be done. The decision had been made, quietly, without witness, and for this night, that was enough. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through low clouds and a thin veil of snow that softened the light before it reached the window. The man woke with the familiar stiffness already present, his body reminding him that the night's decision had not changed its limits. He lay still for a moment, listening, waiting for the rush of doubt that often greeted him at the start of difficult days. It did not come. Instead, there was only the steady awareness of where he was and why. He pushed himself upright with care, pausing when his balance wavered, and rested his feet on the floor until sensation returned. Pain followed its usual path through his joints, persistent but predictable. He acknowledged it without frustration. This, too, was part of staying. The German shepherd stirred at the sound of movement, lifting his head before rising fully. His motions were slower than they once had been, but deliberate, unhurried. The man noticed the way the dog waited, giving him time, matching his pace without instruction. They moved through the morning together in silence. The kitchen was colder than the rest of the house, the floor unforgiving beneath his boots. He filled the kettle and waited for it to heat, leaning lightly against the counter, aware of how much of his weight he allowed it to take. The act felt less like weakness and more like accommodation. He poured water, set food down for the dog, and watched as the animal ate, pausing now and then as if listening inward. When the man lifted his mug, his hand trembled briefly before settling. He did not hide it. He had learned that ignoring signs only made them louder. Outside, the world looked unchanged. Snow covered the yard evenly, the road beyond quiet and empty. There were no markers to indicate that anything significant had happened the night before. He stepped onto the porch and inhaled the cold air carefully, letting it fill his lungs without forcing it. The sensation sharpened his awareness but did not overwhelm him. He did not venture far, only far enough to feel the ground beneath his feet and the dog's presence at his side. They stood together for a moment, facing the same direction, neither of them in a hurry to move. The man realized then that Staying had not solved anything. His body was no stronger. The winter was no less demanding, but something else had shifted. The constant calculation of whether to leave had eased, replaced by a quieter focus on what was directly in front of him. He returned inside and sat by the window again, the chair creaking softly under his weight. The dog settled nearby, close but not touching, content to share the space without claiming it. The man wrapped his hands around the mug, feeling warmth seep into his fingers, and allowed himself a small measure of steadiness. He thought about the road, about how it would still be there tomorrow and the day after that. Leaving remained an option. Staying remained a choice. For now, that distinction mattered. He watched the light change slowly across the snow, marking the passage of time without urgency. This morning did not feel triumphant. It felt ordinary. And in that ordinariness, the man found something he had not expected, the sense that continuing, even quietly, was enough. The day continued without announcement, the light outside shifting slowly as clouds thinned and thickened again, marking time in subtle ways that asked for no attention. The man remained by the window for much of the morning, not because he had nowhere else to be, but because this was where his body allowed him to settle most easily. He had learned to listen for those permissions. They came quietly now, offered rather than taken. The German shepherd rested nearby, occasionally lifting his head when a sound passed the house, then lowering it again when nothing required response. Together, they occupied the room without urgency. The man reflected on how different staying felt compared to the way he had once imagined it. He had expected resistance, perhaps regret, or the sharp edge of doubt returning with daylight. Instead, there was only a steady acceptance of what was. His body was still limited, the winter was still present, but the sense of being forced toward an outcome had loosened its grip. He realized that for years he had equated endurance with motion, with pushing forward regardless of cost. Now, endurance looked different. It looked like adaptation. It looked like choosing not to exhaust what little remained simply to prove a point no one was asking him to make. He shifted in the chair, adjusting his posture to ease the pressure in his spine, and allowed himself to rest without apology. The dog responded instinctively, moving just enough to maintain closeness without contact. The man smiled faintly at that, a brief expression that did not reach for meaning beyond the moment. He understood then that staying was not a declaration. It did not require explanation or witness. It was a practice, repeated quietly each day, informed by awareness rather than pride. He thought about the road again, about how it remained available, unchanged by his choice. That knowledge no longer felt like a threat. It was simply an option, one that did not need to be exercised immediately. For now, what mattered was the present arrangement of his days, the balance between effort and rest, the companionship that did not demand performance. He reached down and rested his hand on the dog's back, feeling warmth and steadiness beneath his palm. The animal did not react beyond a slight shift of weight, acknowledging the contact without interrupting his calm. The man closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to take inventory. He was tired. He was slower. He was still here. That, he realized, was enough. When he opened his eyes again, the light had changed slightly, brightening the snow outside. The world continued on its own terms. Inside the house, the man remained seated, grounded by choice rather than circumstance. He did not know how many days like this remained. He no longer needed to. Staying, he understood now, was not about duration. It was about presence, and in choosing that, quietly and without ceremony, he had already done what he needed to do. This story wasn't really about winter, or age, or even survival. It was about the quiet moments, when no one is watching, when the world isn't asking anything from you, and you still have to decide who you are. In everyday life, we all face moments like this, choosing whether to stay patient, stay kind, stay present, or walk away because it feels easier. Sometimes the strongest decisions aren't loud or visible. They're the ones made silently, simply by continuing. If this story reminded you of a time you stayed when it would have been easier to leave, or a moment when someone stayed for you, share that in the comments below. Reading those experiences helps others feel understood and less alone. If stories like this still matter to you, consider subscribing. There are more waiting for you here.